My name is Mark Christie. I'm with Stony Point. I'll be leading our session today, and we're just getting going. If you're just joining in now, we're just getting started. So here's what I've got planned for us today. I'm just going to put my own timer on right now just to keep myself honest about it. And let's go here. All right. Okay. I'm going to spend about 45 minutes or so going through the presentation. If you have any questions, withhold them to the end. There'll be 15 minutes or so, and I'm certainly happy to stay on longer than that if you like. There'll be 15 minutes at the end for questions. If you want to pose any in the chat box, by all means go for it, and my colleague Andrea, who's on the call, will be collecting those, and we can post those up at the end. All right, so 3 sections for today. First of all, I'm going to just talk about the challenge of Salesforce adoption, why it's a struggle for many organizations, and what are the 3 most common reasons for it happening. There's more than 3, trust me. But in our experience at Stony Point, I'm going to tell you the 3 that we see the most. I'm primarily going to look at sales team reasons. 2 of them are really of the reasons that are applicable to any team. The 3rd is really structured for a sales organization. After that, we'll talk about this concept of change management. We'll dive into what does change management mean, actually. It's a term that I suspect everyone on the call has heard of and used probably, but let's talk about what it really is. And then we'll finish off with different change management strategies and tools to help overcome this adoption challenge. Okay, this is me. I'm Mark Christie. I'm your host for today. I've been training in Salesforce for just 10 years now. 2010 is when I started really focusing on Salesforce in my training practice, and I've been doing training and adoption consulting ever since. Before I became a trainer, I had a successful, I hope, career in sales and sales management up here in my country of Canada. I worked mainly in the payment processing industry. And then in 2006, I sort of threw all that away and I became a sales trainer. And objection handling and prospecting and all that good stuff you learn in the sales training course. And what I discovered was that fairly early on was that there was this big demand for organizations to have help with Salesforce.com. So remember, Salesforce.com really started in 1999 and was just really growing in its first 5 years. And around 2006, when I became a trainer, it really started to explode. And there was a number of teams that were saying to us, yeah, Mark, prospecting's fine, objection handling is great, but where we really need help is understanding the Salesforce thing. So I started to look into that and then focused full-time on training in Salesforce around 2010. And as you can see from sort of my formal education there, I'm a pretty data-driven analytical fellow. And one of the big things we like to do in our adoption programs is track adoption. So define adoption and track it and measure it. And of course, one of the beautiful things of Salesforce, it is a fantastic tool to track data, right? And so not only can we try to improve your users' adoption of the tool, but we can track our progress of adoption right within Salesforce. So very big believers in that. And I am, like I said, based up here in Canada, in Toronto. All right, so let's just talk about the adoption challenge and what it means and why it happens. So, I think the best analogy I can give you is this. Think about Apple and think about Salesforce.com, both cutting edge, world-class technology, all right? And let's talk about Apple for a second. The genius of Steve Jobs was always great technology and really easy to understand and use technology for the end user. And I always go back to the first time I bought an iPhone. And so I can tell you I was using a BlackBerry. prior to that, because I was a very devoted fan of Canadian technology. And then one day, I think I dropped my BlackBerry in the lake and it was time to replace it. And I decided to go and get myself an iPhone, and knowing really nothing about it other than what it looked like. And I'm sure this is like everybody out there, that when I turned on the iPhone for the very first time, in about 5 minutes, I was a pretty proficient user, right? I could figure out there's one on-off button and it opens up all these apps, and I can go through these apps, and I know how to use the email, and I know how to use the calendar, and I know how to use text, and now I figure out the other apps as I go along. And it did not take long at all. And then what I didn't know, my kids would gladly show me along the way. So that is Apple. Now, Salesforce is, like Apple, great technology. There's really no dispute about it. It is the #1 CRM in the world, and it's #1 for a number of reasons. But it is certainly leading edge technology. However, it is not, unlike Apple, intuitive, right? It is not something that you just throw licenses at your sales team and say, there you go, guys, get to work, go use it. It doesn't work that way, sadly. Well, maybe not for a training company like us. It's not sad. It's actually quite good. But for the rest of us, it just doesn't work like that. And so we can build the greatest tool. We can customize it with our implementation partners as well as we want. And by just throwing it at sales teams, it is unlikely to move the needle on adoption. It just isn't going to work that way. And it doesn't mean people aren't smart, because your salespeople probably are. And it doesn't mean they're not motivated, because I'm sure they are. It just means they're human beings, right? And learning new technology and changing their behaviors, their habits, regardless of what they're coming from, is not something that we are good at doing as human beings. It's just not what we're wired to do. So we need a strategy to get there. Okay, so let's look now at the 3 key reasons for poor sales adoption. Now, there's more than 3, I grant you that. These are the 3 that we would encounter most often in our practice as training and change management practitioners at Stony Point. #1 reason for poor Salesforce adoption, very simple. They just don't understand it well enough. Your users haven't gone through a training program, a formal training program that was hands-on and customized to the way they are meant to use it. So simple as that. They just don't really understand it. It was treated like it was an iPhone when we know that it wasn't. #2 reason, and this could happen even if you had great training. Let's say, hey, we solved for problem 1, we brought in great training, but after that, there's often this, there's lack of time, or a perceived lack of time by the salesperson, and remember, perception is reality, or they are unwilling to change their process, meaning the organization has brought in Salesforce, they might have even put great training in front of people, but they haven't built a reinforcement or a coaching plan, and they haven't given people time to learn and embrace the tool and get management on board with it. And you got to remember, salespeople are busy, right? We load them down with monthly or quarterly targets that they've got to hit. So they've got a lot to do. And unless we provide time and space for learning and adopting the tool, it's unlikely to happen naturally, even with the increase in knowledge. So that's one of the big reasons we're likely to see a low adoption. And the 3rd reason, this one is interesting. This is the one that I would say applies most to sales users. The other 2 apply just to users in general. This is really sales users. They feel as if they are being micromanaged, especially if they're moving from simply reporting in Excel, and now you're moving to Salesforce, and there's this sense of, geez, why do they want me to record all my calls? Why do I have to put all my plans in here? Why are my opportunities listed for everyone to see? How come everyone now wants to see what I'm doing all day long? It's not a very comforting feeling. And so it is interesting. As a trainer, I am brought in to help organizations put together a training plan, and we would run that for them, and we will come in to do the training. And I have been asked to do this, and so many times I can't count it, but an organization will say to me, Mark, when you come in and train us the day of training, make sure that you start with a section on why this is going to benefit them. You got to let them know, Mark, why, what's in it for them, right? Otherwise, they won't like it. And my polite, diligent trainer response is, yes, absolutely, we'll cover that. My silent, or perhaps not silent, depending on who I'm speaking to, voice says, listen, if me as the trainer is coming in and telling people what the benefit of Salesforce is on the morning of training, that messaging is far too late, far too infrequent, and it is being delivered by the wrong person. And what we're going to see a little bit down the road is the research that we leverage for our change management practices would suggest that that messaging needs to come far earlier, far more often, and from a different set of people. And we'll talk about that. So those are really the three key reasons that we encounter. We see lots of other reasons, but I would say that those are the top three that we're going to see in our practice for why adoption is a challenge. Now, all right, well, what can we do about this? So let's move now to phase 2 of this presentation. And our solution for low Salesforce adoption is a structured approach to change management. And that's what we try to bring to all of our projects. So let's talk about what do we mean by change management. And I'll also address this last comment I made. We try to bring that to all of our clients. So I'll talk about the try part, and that'll be a theme, a recurring theme throughout. But let's talk about change management. It's a term that I'm certain all of you have heard before, but what really is it? Well, here is the textbook definition of change management. Change management is the application of a structured process and a set of tools for leading the people side of change. Leading the I had my GoToMeeting window in the way. For leading the people side of change to achieve a desired outcome. So let's look at that again. There's 4 key elements. It is the application of a structured process, which we will show you, and a set of tools, which we will show you some. There's many of them. For leading the people side of change to achieve our desired outcome, okay? So let's focus first on this back half of that equation, the people side of change and the desired outcome. Let's talk about that first, and then we'll get to the structured process and tools in section 3. Now, I think that the easiest way to think about change management is to compare it with project management, another term I'm certain all of you are familiar with. And you're likely much more familiar and comfortable with what project management means. So let's put the two side by side. And I think that what that does is it gives you a very clear understanding of the difference between the two and what change management really is and what it can do. So let's look at a standard Salesforce implementation. An organization is, and this is really applicable for any technical change. It doesn't have to be Salesforce, but because that's what we do at Stony Point, we're going to talk about that. So let's assume the organization is introducing Salesforce as its CRM, regardless of whether they're changing from an in-house or another CRM tool or simply Outlook with Excel spreadsheets, whatever it is, we're adding Salesforce. Now, the organization is currently sitting in the red box. It's here's what is happening today. Here's what we do today. Here's the tools we use today, and here's how people do their jobs today. And our goal is the green box. We want to achieve the future state where Salesforce is implemented, everybody's using it, and we're getting all of the ROI that we hoped to when we first bought our licenses. And then in between is this big area where we're going to transition and get from our red to our green. So what organizations will often do is they'll bring in outside consulting firms. They may use internal resources, but in any regard, they are going to implement a project management plan. Almost unheard of that if you're implementing Salesforce, you would not bring in some sort of project management team or a plan in order to get there. And what project management focus is, it is on the technical side of moving from the current state to the future state. So it's the team that comes in place and starts to configure and build Salesforce to map to your business and your sales processes. And of course, the process, they vary, but in general, you're looking at, the initial discovery phase of understanding what the project is going to entail, then all of the planning, the design, and then the build or the implementation, followed by a project wrap-up. All right, so that I think is probably standard for everyone, and everyone has seen that in play. Now, let's talk about what change management is. And change management is our focus on the people side of moving from that current state to the future state. That is really what we mean by change management. Project management on the technical side, change management on the people side. And like project management, change management has a process as well. And we'll cover this in a little bit more detail down later on. But we're looking at helping the organization prepare for the change, and then managing that change as it happens, and then reinforcing the change. Now, when should change management start and when should it end? Ideally, change management starts on day one. When the project management team is brought in place, ideally, the change management team is also put into place, and we're working on both concurrently. That does not often happen. And if you've been involved in a transition to Salesforce, and even if you're a year after it's ended and you're going, geez, we implemented a year ago, but we're not really getting the adoption, does that mean change management won't work because we didn't bring it in? No, not at all. We can implement it now. It's never too late. I'm saying ideally, the best time to do it is at the beginning. The second best time to do it is right now. Now, project management, does it have an end date? Does it close? Well, probably not really. When you think about implementing Salesforce technically, yes, the project has milestones and dates and does ultimately come to an end. But often projects, once one is over, another one starts, and we start doing more things with Salesforce because Salesforce continues to grow and we want to continue to do more things. So project management is generally ongoing. Change management is too. We want to reinforce the change over and over and over again. And if you think about organizations, we hire new people, people come, people go. So it doesn't really end. There's just less of a focus on it after we've really got the adoption that we had wanted. Okay, so now, in order to understand what change management is and how it works, it's critical to understand two very fundamental tenets of change, indisputable, inarguable facts about change. And they are this. Number one, organizational change. So an organization that we talk about organizational change all the time. Organizational change requires individual change. At the end of the day, organizations, what are they? Well, they're simply bricks and mortar and buildings, and then they're the people who work there. And in order for the organization to change, we're really speaking about individuals who work there, having them change their habits, their behaviors, their patterns, change what they do. And the second tenet, which is really a follow-on to that, is our organizational outcomes, those outcomes that we desire, whether they're revenue goals, whether they're productivity goals, whatever the goals are, and however we want to measure them, those outcomes are simply the collective result of individual change. All right, same as the first. So what we're really pointing to is we need to get individuals in the organization each to come along on this journey with us and change their behavior if we're going to make sure we hit our outcomes. So let's go back to our boxes, our current state, transition state, and future state. So we all have this idea when we start a project of what we want to happen, and we want it to, in a perfect world, hit all of our organizational objectives and our outcomes and our goals and get every benefit we possibly can. So we're going to implement Salesforce.com, and we're going to move from the current to the future, and with a little bit of luck and a lot of elbow grease, we're going to realize all of our benefits. Now, think about that green box for a second. The green box in its entirety is the organization. But as we know, organizations are made up of all these individuals. And because of our tenet of change, organizational outcomes are the result of individual change. What we have to do is we have to make sure that in order to achieve our objectives, every individual comes along with us as much as they possibly can. But without proper planning in place, instead of the nice box over on the left, you're more likely to get something like this, whereas we get, yeah, some individuals come along, and while a few of them embrace it and move forward and do really well with it, many others have gaps in the way they use it, and they use workarounds and shortcuts. And then, of course, there's a number of individuals that just say, forget it, man, I'm using Excel. That's what I know. That's what I like. I've only got 3 years to go before I'm done here anyway. So, you know, that's where I sit. So we do see a lot of that. And so instead of getting this, we're going to get something like this, whereas our transition state is really half-baked. We might have a great project management team, a great project management plan. We absolutely kill it when it comes to setting up Salesforce correctly, but without a change management strategy in place, our future state is going to look more like a block of Swiss cheese. And what does that mean? Well, it means lower ROI, longer wait for improvement, more employee resistance, and generally greater dissatisfaction. So with a proper plan, we look for something called SUP. All right, these are the 3 focus areas with a true change management plan, SUP. So what's up, right? What's up? What was that Budweiser commercial? Whatever. What's up? So what is SUP? Well, SUP is how well we implement change management at an individual level determines this. It determines our speed of adoption, how quickly will our employees get on board, our ultimate utilization, how many of them, so instead of having all those little Swiss cheese with people missing, we want as many people as possible to be embracing the tool, and proficiency. We want them to use it well. You know, it's not just enough to log in and store an opportunity. If that's our adoption plan calls for more than that, we have to understand what it is we're measuring in terms of proficiency. So speed of adoption, how quickly we embrace it, the ultimate utilization, how many, and proficiency, how well or how effectively. So let's have a look at a financial perspective on change management. So this is a standard Salesforce implementation project. We allocate a certain amount of time for it to take place. Perhaps it's 4 months, perhaps it's 4 quarters or a year, whatever it is. And we allocate a budget for that. We know we're going to spend money, and we're going to have to make an investment in getting Salesforce up and running. But ultimately, once it's implemented, this is our goal, right? We're going to be more proficient. I mean, why did we bring in Salesforce in the first place? We want to be more proficient. We want to be faster, better, quicker to market, and generally make more money, right? I mean, ultimately, the money we put into Salesforce and the implementation should generate positive cash flow in the long run. Now, let's look at the financial challenges associated with poor Salesforce adoption or the poor speed, utilization, and proficiency of Salesforce. Well, arguably, our upfront investment is less, right? If we're not bringing in a change management strategy, we're not paying for a change management resource or a team, we're not taking time to look at it. So yeah, you could say, yeah, we're not going to spend as much there. But once we're ready to implement, if we haven't addressed the people side of change, guess what? Generally, it'll fall flat because we've got great technology that people are unwilling or unable to use. And so we got to go back to the drawing board, start again, throw some more money at it, and kind of re-tackle it. All right. And then ultimately we'll get there, but we're going to get there at a much slower pace because, again, our speed of adoption, the number of people using it and how well they use it is not nearly as strong as it could be. And ultimately, organizations will get there. Will they get all the way there? Maybe, maybe not. But it will certainly take much longer and have much less likelihood of us getting the gains that we were looking to get. So, for a little bit more planning and expenditure in the front end, we can make a considerably better ROI on the back. All right. So that is really the back end of our definition. So we looked, I think, and hopefully made the case for what is the people side of change, why that's critical to organizational change, and then looking at some of our desired outcomes. And certainly, if nothing else, the financial outcome should supersede all that. I mean, if there's a reason for change management, just look no further than what your finance team is going to be asking for. So let's now focus on the third phase. Let me just do a quick time check. Good, I'm perfectly where I want to be. Let's look now at what we mean by a structured process and a set of tools. So what are these strategies and tools that we can use to help us? All right. Now, change management as a term is universal, right? It's a term we're familiar with. There are a number of methodologies in place. These are the 8 most popular. I am familiar by name only of some of them. I'm completely unfamiliar with others. Nudge theory. I don't know what nudge theory is. It sounds interesting. I'll have to look it up. But these are generally considered sort of the 8 premier change management methodologies. And the one we espouse to its Stony Point is the ProSci ADKAR model. What's interesting is ProSci is the organization. ADKAR is one of many, many, many tools that they use, but they are most well known for ADKAR. And if you'd ever heard of ProSci, chances are you've heard of their one tool called ADKAR. And I will cover ADKAR because it is their most popular tool, but it is one of many. It is one of many tools they use. And so, why have we chosen ProSci? The others have merit. There's no question about it. But ProSci is what they are. They are a research management company, absolutely committed to change management best practices. They've been around since 1994 with 3 offices globally in Fort Collins and in Canada and Australia. They are the world's largest body of change management research focusing on the people side of change. So they do extensive studies, and they run them every 2 years, and they continue to build upon their body of knowledge. But they would have the largest body of change management research globally. And all of their strategies and their tools are based on this research. I'm going to give you a little example of this research in a story in just a little while. But they have a certification program as well. So 50,000 more or less certified change management practitioners worldwide. So this is where we fall. So this is their process. This is their process at a very, very high level, preparing for change, managing change, and reinforcing change. Now, pretty standard stuff right there. Understand that each one of these areas has a significant amount of work in behind it. And I'm not here to get into all of that, but understand these are the processes that we would follow on a standard Salesforce adoption plan. Now, do we use every tool all the time? Absolutely not. Every client that comes to us is in a different circumstance, have different reasons for changing. We do a lot of assessments early on to help us define the change management strategy. It is not a one-size-fits-all. That's certainly for sure. So we start our engagements with assessments to really see where we're at. But I want to draw your attention on this to one very, very key element that we look at in phase 1, and it is about preparing your change management team and developing our sponsorship model. And what this really highlights is the fundamental difference, or the key difference, between project management and change management. And this is really the crux of what change management is, in my opinion. So when we think about project management, the work that is done by the implementation partner often is that work, which is the configuring of Salesforce in this case, right? Like the page layouts and the user acceptance testing and the integration with other systems, right? You know, and the pick list, all of that stuff. That work is done by the project team. And in many cases, they're working using agile methodology and they're working in sprints. And every 2 weeks or so, they'll complete a sprint and they'll engage the executives and managers of the organization and possibly the end users as well. And they'll engage them and they'll say, hey, like, this is what we've built. What do you think? How does this work? Okay, let's go back, take this back to the drawing board. That's what we're going to do in our sprints, right? And so the organization is involved, you know, every once in a while to, you know, come in and give their feedback. But the actual work, the doing and the programming is all done by the project management team, whether it's an external resource or internal. But very, very different with change management. The work of change management is not performed by the change management team, at least not entirely. A lot of that work is performed by the executives and the managers, or what we call the sponsors. All right. The change management team is there to act as a supporting function or a coach to those sponsors. But those sponsors have a big, big role in laying the foundation for a successful change management plan. So that is the key difference. So it's not enough to think that, hey, we've hired a change management team to come in and run change management for us. We can sit back and we can kind of join them in a meeting every 2 or 3 weeks and see how it's going. It doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way. It's much more of a, we're here to coach you, but you're going to do the work. And that, sadly, is one of the key reasons change management fails to take hold. It requires a lot of work and effort by individuals at the organization. So it looks something like this, where you've got 4 different groups. You've got your executives and senior managers playing one role, your frontline managers or middle managers and supervisors. I hate the term middle manager, by the way, but that's what they use. Frontlines, you know, I'm thinking of the sales manager, the person who runs the sales team directly, and the change management resource in the middle with the project team also integrating with that as well. But the roles they play are very much divided this way. The executives and managers, senior managers, and the middle managers or frontline managers and supervisors, they are our employee-facing components of change, whereas the change management and resource, it could be one person depending on the size of the project or the team, and the project team are in the back and they're enabling it. Now, what are our roles as sponsors? Well, we simply say it's the ABCs of sponsorship. So it's actively and visibly participate throughout the project, not just at the beginning. It's building a coalition of sponsorship with peers and managers, and it's communicating directly and very, very often with employees. And if you look, you know, we talked about the research that ProSci had done to support the decisions. Well, you know, going back to my story about how organizations bring me in and say, Mark, before training, I want you to just to make a quick comment about what's in it for them. Well, the research would say, if we are changing, we need to create that awareness far, far early, like the very, very beginning of the project. And the messaging needs to be received from 2 groups. The messaging from an organizational change. Why is the organization moving to Salesforce? That is best communicated by our leadership, our CEO, our president, our executive team. That's what that data says. But the message about, well, man, what is this? You know, that sounds great, but what does it mean for me? What's my job going to look like? How is this going to impact me? Am I going to get fired? The real stuff people ask, that needs to be heard from the frontline manager, the employee supervisor or manager. And so to hear it from the trainer on the morning of training is just not the right person or the right time or the right frequency. And this is the type of stuff we tackle with change management plans. Now, quickly, let's look at phase 2, which is our managing the change. Very, very big phase. And if you look at it, there's a number of plans we bring in to work. Because the communications plan, our roadmap for sponsors, our coaching plan, the resistance management plan. It is normal to see resistance from employees. It is going to happen. And so there's no disputing it. It is just, people are going to resist this. And so understanding that and then building a mitigation strategy around that is what has to happen. And then finally, a training plan. Now, it's interesting, at Stony Point, we are a training company. We are a training and an adoption company. We are brought in often by implementation partners that do great work on the technical side, but would say, hey, we're not a training company. We work with Stony Point. So we've got a number of very good relationships with implementation partners that don't want to or aren't equipped to do the training. And we're brought in solely for training with not much of an eye to these other areas. So training is absolutely essential. It is a part of a change management strategy, but as you can see, it is one of a number of parts of a true change management plan. And then phase 3, without going into a lot of detail, really talks about what happens when the training is done. How do we get people to actually take that knowledge and translate it into actionable and observable and measurable behavior? And once again, that falls on the organization. So if you think about it, the training is the one area that an organization can outsource. You can bring in Stony Point and we can put together training programs, and largely your executives and managers don't need to do much other than help us with some of the design of the training curriculum. But the rest of that work is done by the organization itself. Now, let's just look at one of many of the tools that ProSci works with, and it's called ADKAR. So you may have heard of ADKAR, and what ADKAR stands for is awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. And what we're talking about here is we're focused on an individual's change journey. We're focusing on what every individual must go through in succession in order to realize successful change. And so the premise here is that every individual must go through these steps of change in a sequential order, meaning they can't move to ability without having the knowledge, right? That makes a lot of sense. You can't be a proficient at something unless you're shown how to do it. But likewise, you can't start with the knowledge until the desire has been put in place first. And you can't espouse desire among individuals until they're aware of the need for change. So like I said, at Stony Point, we're often brought in to do what? We're brought in as trainers to bring in the knowledge piece. But sadly and unfortunately, the awareness and desire piece have not been implemented first. And so training without checking on the awareness and desire is less effective. Meanwhile, if all we do is train organizations and walk away, and there's not a plan in place for the ability and reinforcement to be coached by the organization with support from us, you'll also have less likelihood of success. So for us at Stony Point, these are our 5, we've got a model as well. It follows very closely to the ProSci model, but we're often brought in as a without change management strategies in place, and we're brought in to train. And so we have to accommodate for that circumstance on a number of occasions. So what we say is, listen, there are really 5 key elements for successful training and adoption initiatives, and they're all important, but there's just some that are critically important and some that we put it lower on the list. So we would say number 5, we need executive sponsorship. If the executives are just going to say, hey, everyone, you need to be good at Salesforce, but we as executives are still going to pour over our Excel spreadsheets, that's going to be a problem. We're going to need to define our adoption goals and our objectives. It's not just enough to say, hey, let's make sure everybody's in Salesforce every day using it for everything, and run with it. No, that's not a very good objective for adoption. We want to be very clear about saying we want to become more productive, and what does that mean? Well, productivity means these 5 things, and here's how we're going to measure it. And then we want people to do this by when. So we want to implement SMART goals for each of our adoption objectives. We definitely want to ensure that our system is aligned with our processes. We've worked with a number of organizations that have worked with implementation partners that have done a tremendous job implementing CPQ, for instance, and yet when we go to work with the sales users, they still need to do something on the iPhone with 3 clicks as opposed to 1. So we're talking about an alignment with all areas of the business so that Salesforce is as easy to use as can possibly be. Number 2, absolute end user training, which you'd be surprised why that's not number 1. So critically important end user training. But number 1, in our opinion, absolutely fundamentally, is that frontline manager training. Nothing will have more impact on your organization's ability to adopt the solution like frontline managers buying into the tool. So our programs place a very, very heavy emphasis on training those managers throughout they get the most training of anyone. And the belief is simply this: if managers know how to use Salesforce and embrace it, they will do whatever they can, from our experience, to get their teams to use it, because the change management team can't get users to use the system. The executives can't get users to use the system. It is the frontline manager that has the most impact on that user. Frankly, the frontline manager has actually a tremendous amount of impact on the people above them as well, the executives above them as well. But if the manager buys into the tool, they're going to start running their weekly pipeline reviews with Salesforce. They're going to coach their people how to use Salesforce. They're going to slowly bring their people along. They're going to give them the time and space to get better at it. Eventually, they're going to be more stick than they are carrot, right? If someone after 6 months still isn't using it, managers are going to start using whatever they need to do to get them there. But managers are such a fundamental component of our adoption plan. So all are important, don't get me wrong. And this is all part of a fully baked change management process. But we felt, this is a key slide to understand kind of the order of priority and just how important those managers are. Now, just a little, not exactly what change management is here, but as a training organization that's been around since 2011, these are, our highlights of our training offering. We are a focused training organization. That's what we do. We focus on training and adoption at Stony Point. And we've got both live instructor-led on-site training. We deliver a lot of virtual classes, more now with COVID, obviously. Also in person, we'd be thrilled when we can get back to that. Custom classes, standard classes, classes for end users, classes for technical administrators, developers, certification courses to prepare you for the Salesforce certification exams, global training, training in multiple languages with our partners, and digital solutions for e-learning, number of the most breadth and varied training coverage, frankly, around the world. Okay, so in conclusion, why change management? Very, very simple. Change management will help increase the probability of your project's success. A great project management implementation with fabulous technical design and no adherence to change management, much less likely to succeed. Employee resistance to change. It's going to happen. We need to have tools in place to address it. We absolutely want to capture our people-dependent ROI. And ultimately, if we succeed with a Salesforce change management implementation, and change, if we succeed with a Salesforce implementation through change management, we as an organization, or you as an organization, become much better for your next change. Lord knows, Salesforce is far from your first and far from your last change initiative. Organizations are constantly adapting and evolving to change due to market conditions. and being an effective organization of change serves you well down the road. That concludes the lecture part of the presentation. I'm showing 2:17, so that was exactly 45 minutes. And certainly I will open the door up for questions, comments. All right, here's a question. Do you help with change management for transitioning from Salesforce Classic to Lightning? Absolutely, that's a great question. In fact, I would say that's probably the #1 project we're entailing now, is people going from Classic to Lightning. So whether it's a brand, and that's a great point, and I failed to sort of even mention that, but you know, I had kept on sort of pointing to the example of Salesforce implementation from something different like Excel or Dynamics or whatever, but absolutely, Salesforce Classic to Salesforce Lightning entails change. That is a technology change, and I'm certain that you'd have a project management team in place for that. That's absolutely a change that would require a change management plan to be effective. Very good question. So 100%, and that is probably the #1 project that we're working on today. We have for a few years now, and I suspect we will for another year or so while everyone gets onboarded with Lightning. Thank you. Great question. Anyone else? Joe here saying, during sales rep adoption training, how much do you explain behind the change management process? Okay, very good question. So a lot. But it depends on, so as change management practitioners, we're heavily involved with the executive leadership and the frontline managers, not as much the users, because the message of change, the why are we changing, look what this is going to do for us, it's going to help you, all of the benefits to the users, that really needs to come from those executives and those frontline managers. That's not where the users need to hear from the change management practitioners. We're supporting and coaching the executives on the right methods of communication, the frequency of communication. We'll draft the communication, frankly. I mean, we'll write it out. Some organizations need help with that. So we'll coach that communication. We're not the voice of that communication. So how much do we explain it? We don't explain it, the organization does, and they do it a lot. It's not one and we're done. It's multiple town hall meetings, emails, newsletters, all sorts of communication vehicles months in advance of the implementation change that the organization would do. So hopefully I answered your question, Joe. There was another one here. Oh, just a thank you. Well, thank you very much. And then Joe, second question, other way, do you have the management team explain the change management process overtly, or is it, I see what you're saying. Do we have them explain the change management process? Yes, but not sort of in the scientific way that I went through. I guess the best slide to sort of point you to that. Let me just go back to the ADKAR slide. One of the models we use, ADKAR, again, ADKAR is a model. So what we do here when we're talking about, where did I put it here? Oh, it's right here. Okay. One of the things we do in terms of explaining, so we don't really explain the change management process as much as we would say, okay, step one is creating an awareness in the organization of why are we moving to Salesforce, or why are we upgrading to Lightning, to answer the earlier question. So the communication is more focused on creating an awareness and helping people understand the need for change and helping them, so what they hear is, or what we want to hear to know that we were successful is, okay, I now understand why we're moving to Lightning. I understand why we're moving to Salesforce. We would not, the executives and managers wouldn't necessarily say to everybody, hey, everybody, we're about to change over to Salesforce Lightning. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to help you understand why. After that, we're then going to get you excited about it. So we wouldn't walk them through kind of the steps of change management. But we would absolutely, the executives would understand what the steps are. The users wouldn't necessarily know that now we're in the desire phase. They would know that training is going to take place in October and the coaching is going to take place in November, but they wouldn't necessarily know that there's all these steps in place. Okay, hey, no problem. Appreciate it. That's a great question, by the way. I had to think a little bit about the answer. So any question that makes me think how to answer is a good question. Hey, absolutely. Thank you. Appreciate that very much.